When my wife Marianne and I decided to adopt a child, it felt like destiny. Marianne had been in a foster home herself around that age, placed there after a tragic car accident had taken her parents. She was 8 years old when her whole world turned upside down, and now here we were, with the chance to change the life of an 8-year-old ourselves. The child we chose, a quiet boy, stood out the moment we saw him at the foster home. He had a certain depth in his eyes, like he had already seen too much for someone his age. I remember thinking he was an old soul, someone who carried more weight than any child should. The foster home told us he had no name, no history. He was just found wandering the streets alone. They did not know where he had come from, and no relatives had shown up to claim him. They had given him the name Jeremiah, and it was the only name he responded to, the only word he had shared when they found him. I thought of how strange it was, adopting a child with no past, but in some way, it drew us in more. Marianne and I felt that his mysterious history was a puzzle meant for us to solve. I think she saw herself in him, lost and alone at 8 years old. But while she had found a family, Jeremiah seemed to have nothing. From the start, it was not easy. The first few months with Jeremiah at home were full of challenges. He kept to himself, drifting around the house in a quiet, ghostly way. He would sit alone in dark corners, staring at nothing, and sometimes we would hear faint sobs coming from his room at night. When we checked on him, he would quickly dry his eyes and lie down as if nothing was wrong. It was heartbreaking, really, hearing him cry like that, yet feeling so helpless to comfort him. We had no idea what haunted him, what memories or fears he carried around, and he would not tell us no matter how we tried. Marianne and I poured everything we had into reaching him. We took him to therapists, child psychologists, even art therapists, hoping to unlock whatever was tormenting him. But he remained an enigma. He was polite, but distant. Sometimes he would draw pictures that made no sense, dark shapes and symbols that seemed to come from nowhere. Other times he would blast loud music just to fill the silence, as if the quietness itself was too much for him to bear. Marianne had a unique bond with Jeremiah. She had been a foster child too, so she understood the feeling of being alone, of being without roots. She tried taking him out on little trips, just the two of them, in hopes that maybe he would open up to her. One day, after months of gentle nudges, Marianne's patience wore thin. She begged him to tell us something, anything, about what had happened to him. Jeremiah looked up at us with those dark, haunted eyes and, to our surprise, finally spoke. "Can we all take a DNA test?" he asked out of the blue. The request was so bizarre that it left us stunned, but we agreed, hoping it might help him somehow, though we had no clue what he was looking for. When the results came back, we felt like the ground had shifted under us. Marianne and I had no idea how it was possible, but the test showed that Jeremiah was our biological son. It was as if we had been thrown into a nightmare. We had never had a son before, or so we thought. The foster home had said he was found alone with no family, no ties. How could he be ours? Then Jeremiah, with a calmness that sent a chill down my spine, explained, "In the future, you and Mom had me, but something went wrong. Everything went wrong." Our minds reeled as he told us the impossible. He was from a future where civilization had been almost entirely destroyed, a world of chaos and ruin. Only a handful had survived, and those who did found a way to send him, our future son, back to us, to this time. "You only have 20 years, he whispered, his voice barely audible. 20 years until it all begins. After that night, everything changed. The comfortable, predictable life Marianne and I had worked so hard to build felt like it was slowly unraveling. The revelation that Jeremiah was somehow our son from the future was hard enough to believe, let alone accept. It felt like we were caught in a dream, the kind you struggle to wake up from but cannot escape. I remember lying awake night after night, my mind racing with questions. How was it possible? Why would he be sent here, to us, of all people? And what did he mean by 20 years until it all begins? Jeremiah, meanwhile, seemed unaffected by our shock. If anything, he grew more at ease around us, like he had finally unburdened himself of a secret he had been holding in for too long. But that did not make things easier. He still drifted through the house like a shadow, quiet and distant, his presence unsettling in ways I could not explain. Sometimes I would catch him watching us, his gaze too intense, too knowing for a child. It was as if he saw us not just as his parents, but as people he already knew from a different time. One night, about a week after the DNA results, I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but not quite. I lay there straining to hear, feeling Marianne's steady breathing beside me. There it was again, a faint rhythmic murmur coming from down the hall. I got up quietly, trying not to disturb her, and made my way toward the noise. As I got closer to Jeremiah's room, the sound grew louder, clearer. It was a low, repetitive chant, words I could not quite make out. The door was slightly open, and I peered inside. Jeremiah was sitting cross-legged in the center of his room, facing the wall. The room was completely dark except for a faint glow coming from something he held in his hands. As my eyes adjusted, I realized he was holding a small worn notebook. He was whispering to it, his voice so soft it was almost inaudible, like he was speaking to someone who was not there. I stood there frozen, watching him as he rocked slightly back and forth, his eyes fixed on the pages of the book. "Jeremiah," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. He stopped instantly, his head snapping around to look at me. For a moment his expression was blank, unreadable, and then something shifted in his eyes. He looked down at the notebook, then slowly closed it and placed it under his pillow. "Dad," he said in that calm, unsettling voice, "you should go back to sleep." I felt a chill run through me, a sense of unease I could not shake. "What were you reading?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He looked at me, his gaze intense and unblinking. "Just stories," he said softly. "Things you told me in the future." I swallowed, not knowing what to say. "Jeremiah, are you okay? Is there something you want to talk about?" He shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. "No, Dad, not yet. You are not ready to hear it." There was something final in his voice, something that told me I would get no more answers that night. I left his room, closing the door softly behind me, and returned to bed, my mind racing with questions. Who was this child? Our child, from a future that had yet to happen. And what horrors had he seen that had made him like this, so young yet so haunted? Over the next few days, Jeremiah's behavior grew stranger. He would spend hours in his room, reading that notebook, whispering to it like he was confiding in an old friend. Sometimes I would hear him say our names, my name and Marianne's, in that soft, faraway voice, followed by words I could not quite make out. And then there were the drawings. He had never shown any interest in art before, but suddenly he was sketching obsessively, filling page after page with dark, chaotic images that made my skin crawl. One day while he was out of the room, I picked up one of his drawings. It was a detailed sketch of our house, but everything was wrong. The windows were shattered, the roof caved in, and there were dark figures standing in the yard watching. In the background, a thick black cloud loomed over everything, and the trees were twisted and bare. He had drawn Marianne and me too, standing in the doorway, our faces etched with fear. "What does this mean?" I asked him that evening, holding up the drawing. He looked at me calmly, as if he had been expecting the question. "It is a memory," he said, "from my time." His time. The words chilled me to the core. I wanted to ask him more, but a part of me was terrified of the answers. Instead, I simply nodded, placing the drawing back on the table. That night, Marianne and I talked long into the night, sharing our fears, our confusion, and the strange, terrible feeling that something was very, very wrong. We had wanted to give this boy a home, a family, but instead it felt like we had opened the door to something we could not understand, something dark and unfathomable. As the days went on, Jeremiah's words kept haunting me. "You are not ready to hear it." What was it that he knew? What future had he come from? And worst of all, what were we not ready to know? After that night, I could not shake the feeling that our lives were being pulled towards something dark and inevitable. Jeremiah's drawings kept haunting me. The twisted images of our home in ruin, of Marianne and me with fear etched across our faces. Every time I looked at those pictures, I felt a strange sense of dread, like I was glimpsing a version of the future that should not exist. Marianne tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just Jeremiah's way of expressing himself, of dealing with whatever trauma he had endured. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. His words, his calmness, and the way he looked at us. It all felt like he was watching events unfold that he had already seen, as if we were just players in a story he already knew by heart. A few nights later, I woke up to find Marianne sitting up in bed, staring at the doorway. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Hear what?" I asked, my heart pounding. She swallowed, glancing toward the hallway. Someone was whispering. I thought it was you at first, but it sounded like a child. A chill crept down my spine. "Jeremiah?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She shook her head slowly. It did not sound like him. I got up, feeling a strange mix of dread and determination. I walked down the hall, every shadow seeming to stretch and twist in the dim light. As I approached Jeremiah's room, I felt an odd chill, like the air itself had turned icy. His door was ajar, and I could see him sitting up in bed, staring at something across the room. His face was illuminated by the faint glow of his nightlight, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Jeremiah?" I called out softly. He did not turn to look at me. Instead, he kept his gaze fixed on the far corner of the room, his face pale and expressionless. Who are you talking to?" I asked, feeling a knot of fear tighten in my stomach. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "They are watching us," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "They come every night, just to see. They are waiting." My heart pounded in my chest. "Who is waiting, Jeremiah?" He turned his head slowly to look at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You will see them too one day, when the time is right." I stood there, frozen, unable to move or speak. Jeremiah lay back down, pulling the covers up to his chin as if nothing had happened. He closed his eyes, drifting off to sleep while I stood there in the dark, grappling with a terror I could not explain. Over the following weeks, strange things began to happen around the house. Small things at first, a door that would creak open on its own, lights flickering for no reason, objects disappearing only to reappear in the oddest places. One morning I found my wristwatch on the floor in the basement, a place I had not been in weeks. Marianne's favorite coffee mug shattered inexplicably on the kitchen counter, though no one had touched it. But it was not just the objects that unnerved me, it was the atmosphere itself. Our home, once warm and inviting, now felt cold and hostile, like it was rejecting us. The air felt heavy, charged with something unseen but palpable, something that made the hair on my arms stand on end. And then there were the shadows. I began to notice them more and more, out of the corner of my eye, flickering just beyond my field of vision. Dark shapes that seemed to linger in doorways, in the corners of rooms, watching us. At first I thought I was just imagining things, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But Marianne saw them too. One night she woke up gasping, her face pale and her body trembling. "They were here," she whispered, clutching my arm, standing at the foot of the bed, just watching. I held her close, feeling a sense of dread settle deep within me. Whatever Jeremiah had brought into our lives, it was not just a child from the future, it was something else, something that lurked in the shadows, watching, waiting. One evening, as the sun was setting, Jeremiah came up to me with that same calm expression he always wore. "Dad," he said, his voice eerily steady, "do you remember the day we found each other?" I looked at him, unsure how to answer. "You mean the day we met you at the foster home?" He shook his head slowly. The day we met. Long ago, before you knew me." A chill ran down my spine. "Jeremiah, what are you talking about?" He looked up at me, his gaze piercing. "You do not remember yet, but you will, when everything starts again." I stared at him, feeling a strange sense of déjà vu, like I had lived this moment before, but in another life. His words echoed in my mind, filling me with a sense of dread that I could not shake. That night as I lay in bed, I could not stop thinking about what he had said. The day we found each other, long ago, before you knew me. It made no sense, and yet deep down, I felt that he was right, that there was something buried in my memory, something I had forgotten, or chosen to forget. Marian and I grew more desperate to understand him, to figure out what was happening to our family. We began searching for answers, digging through old records, trying to find anything that could explain who Jeremiah was and why he had come to us. But every path we took led to dead ends, blank spaces, unanswered questions. And all the while, Jeremiah watched us, his gaze filled with a quiet, unsettling knowledge. It was as if he was waiting for us to catch up, to remember something we had forgotten, as if he knew that our lives were heading towards something dark, something inevitable. As the weeks went on, the strange events in our house only intensified. It felt like we were trapped in a slow, creeping nightmare, one that only grew darker with each passing day. Marianne and I were barely sleeping. Every time we lay down, the house seemed to come alive around us. The faint whispers in the hall, the creak of floorboards when no one was there, the feeling of cold air brushing against our faces. It was as though something was making itself known, inch by inch. One night I woke to a soft sound coming from the living room. At first I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again. Low, rhythmic, almost like chanting. I got up, my heart pounding, and made my way down the hall, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I approached the living room, I could see a faint light flickering inside, casting eerie shadows across the walls. When I entered, I found Jeremiah sitting on the floor in front of the fireplace, his back to me. He had lit one of our candles, and in the dim glow, I could see him holding that same old notebook he always carried. His lips were moving, muttering words I could not understand, his voice barely a whisper. "Jeremiah," I said softly, trying not to startle him. He stopped, turning slowly to look at me. His eyes were dark, almost hollow, and in that moment, he looked like a stranger. "It is coming, Dad," he said in a voice that did not sound like his own. "They are getting closer." "Who is coming?" I asked, my voice shaking. He looked down at the notebook, tracing his finger along the page. "The ones who followed me, they cannot stay away. They know I am here now. With you." I swallowed hard, a sense of dread filling me. "Why, Jeremiah? Why would they follow you?" He closed the notebook slowly, looking up at me with an expression that was both sad and resigned. "Because they know you will remember, and they do not want that." A chill ran through me. Remember? What could I possibly remember that would make these things come for us? I wanted to ask him more, to press him for answers, but something held me back. The fear in his eyes was real, tangible, and I could tell that whatever he knew, it was something he was not ready to share. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions I could not answer. Marianne sensed my restlessness, but I did not have the heart to tell her what Jeremiah had said. I did not want her to be as terrified as I was. The next day, Marianne and I decided to look through Jeremiah's room while he was outside playing in the yard. We had never gone through his things before, but desperation was driving us. We needed to understand what was happening to our family, and if there was even a small chance we could find answers, we had to take it. We sifted through his drawers, his books, his toys, ordinary things for the most part. But then Marianne opened his closet, and we both froze. Lining the back wall of the closet were pages torn from his notebook, taped up in neat rows. Each page was covered in dark, chaotic drawings that sent a chill down my spine. One page showed a figure standing in the shadows, with dark, hollow eyes and long, twisted fingers reaching out toward a smaller figure, a child. Another page depicted a house on fire, with figures standing outside, watching as the flames consumed everything. And in the corner of every page, in small, neat handwriting, was the word "remember." Marian and I exchanged a look, the weight of fear heavy between us. "What does he want us to remember?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I do not know," I replied, feeling a sick sense of dread settling in my stomach. "But whatever it is, it cannot be good." That night, after Jeremiah had gone to bed, Marianne and I sat down to talk, trying to make sense of everything. She told me she had been having dreams, nightmares really, about a world in ruins, about shadows creeping closer, about a cold, dark presence that felt like death itself. "In my dreams," she said softly, her eyes distant, "there is always a voice. It keeps saying the same thing over and over." Time is running out. A cold shiver ran through me. Jeremiah said something similar, that we only have 20 years. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of those words sink in. Marianne, what if this is real? What if he really is from a future we cannot escape? She looked at me, her face pale, fear etched in her eyes. Then what do we do? I had no answer. All I knew was that whatever was happening, it was beyond anything I could comprehend. Jeremiah's presence in our lives had brought with it a darkness that felt unstoppable, like a storm slowly closing in on us. Over the next few days, I started to notice small, unsettling changes in Jeremiah. He would drift around the house, murmuring to himself in that strange, soft voice, as if he was speaking to someone only he could see. His gaze grew more intense, more distant, and sometimes I would catch him watching Marianne and me with a look that sent a chill down my spine. One evening, he came up to me while I was sitting on the porch, staring out into the twilight. "Dad," he said, his voice calm and steady, "they will come soon. When the night is darkest, you have to be ready." "Ready for what?" I asked, a sense of dread filling me. He looked at me with those dark, haunted eyes. "To remember and to let go." The words made no sense, but something in his tone left me shaken. It was as if he was speaking from a place of knowledge, of certainty, like he was telling me a truth I had yet to understand. That night, as we lay in bed, I held Marianne close, feeling the weight of our fear pressing down on us. The shadows seemed to stretch across the walls, flickering in the dim light, and I could feel the presence of something dark and malevolent lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. I did not know what was coming, but I knew that whatever it was, it would not be kind. And then, in the dead of night, I woke to a strange sound, a low, guttural whisper coming from somewhere in the house. It was faint at first, but slowly, it grew louder until it filled the air, echoing off the walls. I sat up, my heart pounding, and looked over to see that Marianne was already awake, her face pale with terror. "They are here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The shadows. They are in the house." We crept out of bed, holding each other's hands as we made our way down the hall. The air was cold, colder than it had ever been, and a sense of dread filled every corner of the house. As we reached Jeremiah's room, we found him standing in the doorway, his eyes wide, his face calm. "They are waiting," he said softly, looking past us, into the darkness. "For us to remember." And in that moment, as the shadows closed in around us, I felt a memory stir within me. A memory of a world in flames, of twisted figures watching from the dark, of a voice whispering in my ear, "Time is running out." In the days that followed that terrible night, Marianne and I were like strangers in our own home. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint whisper in the walls made us jump. Jeremiah was different too. He was quieter, more withdrawn, like he knew something we did not, something that would forever change our lives. One evening, I decided I could not take it any longer. I needed answers. I needed to understand who or what Jeremiah was. I went to his room and found him sitting on the edge of his bed, staring out the window at the darkening sky. "Jeremiah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "please tell me the truth. What are you hiding from us?" He looked at me, and for a moment, I thought he might ignore me as he usually did. But then he sighed, his shoulders slumping as if he carried a weight far too heavy for a child. "You do not want to know, Dad," he whispered, his voice filled with a sadness that made my heart ache. "Knowing will only bring you pain." "I need to know," I insisted, my voice breaking. "I cannot keep living like this, in fear of shadows and whispers. I deserve to understand why you are here." Jeremiah's gaze met mine, and for the first time I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. "They are the ones who cannot let go," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. "They are the memories of those who did not survive, of the people who were lost when the world ended. They cling to me because I am the last of them." A chill ran through me as his words sank in. The shadows, the figures that haunted our home, were not just ghosts. They were echoes of a future that Jeremiah had somehow escaped, a future that was destined to befall us all. "And why are you here, Jeremiah?" I asked, my voice trembling. Why did you come back? He looked down, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. Because you need to remember what happened. You need to understand, so you can make a different choice. I did not understand what he meant, but before I could ask, Marianne appeared in the doorway, her face pale with fear. Something is happening, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The shadows, they are everywhere. Jeremiah stood up, his face expressionless. It is time, he said, looking at us with an intensity that left me breathless. They have come to make you see. That night, the house felt colder than ever, as though it was sinking into an endless void. The shadows seemed to gather in every corner, their presence suffocating. Marianne and I held each other close, our hearts pounding with terror. And Jeremiah stood between us, his face calm, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. Do not be afraid, he whispered, his voice soft and reassuring. They are here to show you the truth. As he spoke, the shadows began to move, swirling around us like a dark storm. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I felt as though I was falling, tumbling into an endless abyss. And then, suddenly, I was somewhere else, somewhere cold and desolate. I found myself standing on a barren plain, the sky dark and choked with ash. All around me, ruins stretched as far as the eye could see. Twisted metal, broken glass, the charred remnants of buildings that had once stood tall. I heard screams in the distance, faint but unmistakable, the echoes of people crying out in terror. Beside me, I felt Marianne's hand in mine, her grip tight with fear. We were both here in this vision or memory together, witnessing the end of the world. And then I saw him. Jeremiah standing at the edge of a crumbling street, staring at us with an expression that was both familiar and foreign. He looked older here, his face etched with the sorrow of someone who had seen too much, who had lost too much. This is where I came from, he said, his voice heavy with grief. This is the future that awaits you if you do not change what is coming. I tried to speak, to ask him what he meant, but the words caught in my throat. All I could do was stare at the devastation around us, at the empty, lifeless world that stretched out before us. You were there too, Jeremiah continued, his gaze piercing. You tried to save me, to protect me from the horrors that were unfolding. But it was too late. The world had already fallen. I shook my head, unwilling to believe what he was saying. But how? I whispered, my voice barely audible. How can we stop this? Jeremiah looked at us, his eyes filled with a sadness that seemed far beyond his years. By letting go of the past, he said softly, by breaking the cycle. He reached out, his hand hovering over mine, and in that moment, I felt a surge of memories flooding into my mind. I saw flashes of a life I could not remember, but somehow knew. Moments of joy and sorrow, of love and loss, all bound together by a single, unbreakable thread. And then I understood. The shadows, the voices, the haunting visions. They were not just memories of a future that had yet to come. They were memories of a life we had already lived, a life that had ended in ruin. Jeremiah had come back to us, to this moment, because we were bound to repeat our mistakes, to relive the same tragedy over and over unless we found the strength to break free. We have to let him go, Marianne whispered, her voice choked with tears. That is what he wants, what he needs. I looked at Jeremiah, my heart breaking. But you are our son. He smiled, a sad, bittersweet smile. I will always be with you, he said, but it is time for me to go. As he spoke, the shadows began to fade, their forms dissolving into the air like mist. I felt a warmth spread through me, a sense of peace I had not felt in years. The house grew quiet, the coldness lifting, leaving only a faint, lingering sadness. Jeremiah reached out, touching my hand one last time. Thank you, he whispered, for helping me find peace. And with that, he was gone. The shadows disappeared, leaving Marianne and me alone in the silence, our hearts heavy with grief, but also filled with a strange, inexplicable hope. In the days that followed, the house felt lighter, warmer. The whispers were gone, the shadows no longer lurking in the corners. It was as if a great weight had been lifted, a curse broken. And though we missed Jeremiah deeply, we knew he was finally free. his spirit at peace. Every now and then, I would find myself thinking of him, wondering where he had gone, if he had found the happiness he deserved. And sometimes when the house was quiet and the night was still, I would feel a gentle warmth, a soft, comforting presence, as if he was there, watching over us, reminding us that some things are stronger than time, stronger than even the end of the world. Our son had given us a second chance, and I was determined not to waste it.